Skilled South Africans are choosing to emigrate. They cite their frustration with corruption, ailing infrastructure and joblessness. Seeking greener pastures. If anything, the number of South Africans inquiring about countries abroad is growing.
People are saying they've worked hard, they've put their kids through good education, both tertiary education and then great universities in this country. And, you know, the truth is people love this country. It's one of the best in the world. But their kids need options because the future is not looking as good as it was maybe even a few years ago.
I'm surprised. Firstly, I want to talk about the stat I just gave out there. For every one professional coming into South Africa, 8 are immigrating. How true is that?
Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone is very well. So last week we spoke about the case of Marelise Holmes and Eddie Kine III, who were lovers enjoying a really romantic night up Signal Hill when their lives were sadly taken too soon. But I will link that up here if you would like to give that video a watch. Today we are still talking about South Africans who kill, but this time it is not South Africans in South Africa killing, it is South Africans now abroad. And today, this case was suggested by a subscriber, so thank you very much for your suggestions. So just once again, a very big thank you to all the effort that goes into writing to me and letting me know about these cases because they are very helpful and very informative, so thank you very much. But for today's case, we're going to talk about a South African doctor that emigrated with his family to New Zealand and how things were going very well until they were not. So with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
People sometimes say that the grass is greener on the other side, but some say that the grass is greener where you water it. But nonetheless, emigration is not a new thing, and it won't stop being common for many people in many countries to experience. And I think in South Africa, we know of a lot of people, or we know of people who have emigrated or who have come to South Africa from another country. And many people who leave South Africa say that they are looking for better, greener pastures, or maybe just a safer environment or better job opportunities overseas for them and their families. But whatever the reason, it is generally commonplace and it's not unknown to any of us. And for today's case, we are specifically focusing on South Africans who've emigrated and then murdered while overseas. And before on this channel, we have spoken about South Africans who have lived overseas, but they weren't the ones who murdered, they were the ones being murdered. But now we are kind of turning the tables. So with all of that information, let's just start right from the beginning. And the man who we are going to focus all of our attention on today is a man named Dr. Colin Bouwers. Dr. Colin Bouwers was born in South Africa in 1950, and by all accounts he was a very driven and ambitious man. Dr. Colin Bouwers would later go on to study psychology at a university in South Africa, and he would eventually become a very well-known and successful psychiatrist. And he and his first wife had one child together, also named Colin Bouwers. But for Colin Bouwers Jr., his mother is named Mariette Kruger, and those details are important for a little bit later. But for now, let's forget about Mariette and Colin Jr., and let's just stick to Colin Sr., and his new potential family. So like I said, he was twice married, but now he is single. And we skip forward a few years and now we are in Pretoria, South Africa. And we are at a Mensa meeting. And if you're like me, I had absolutely no idea what a Mensa meeting was, but apparently it's for the incredibly elite and very, very bright people of this world. Apparently Mensa is one of the oldest and largest high IQ societies in the world. It is a non-profit organization and it is open to people who score in the 98th percentile or higher for their IQ. And by the judgment of how many takes it took me to read 98th percentile, I'm definitely not in that IQ bracket. But anyway, at this meeting, Dr. Colin Bouwers meets another doctor named Annette. And Annette was a doctor in her own right, and she was a doctor in physiotherapy. And basically, both of them met, and the rest is history. A couple of years later, they got married, and then a couple more years later, they had 2 children. Their firstborn was named Greg, and he was their first son. Their secondborn was their first daughter, and her name is Anthea. When the children were in their early teenage years, Annette and Colin decided that they wanted to move overseas and to raise their children in a better, safer and greener life on the other side in New Zealand. So they left South Africa in 1997 and arrived then in Dunedin Airport. All bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, the four Bouwers then landed in New Zealand and started their new lives. But what Colin was hiding was that he didn't want to move his children away from South Africa because he was looking for a safer, happier, greener pastures. And what we need to realize with Colin right now is that nothing is ever as straightforward with him. Dr. Colin Bouwers actually left South Africa in quite a hurry, mind you, because your well-known, wealthy and highly rated psychiatrist was actually hiding the truth from his wife and his children because he was deemed impaired by the South African Health Professionals Council. And this was due to his pethidine addiction. And pethidine is basically a opioid medication which is used as a pain relief medication for a lot of people. So the family are now in Dunedin, which is stunning with its Edwardian and Gothic style churches and buildings, the beautiful scenery backdrop, and I kind of get why they wanted to move here. And once the Bouwers were settled in, every person who met them thought how amazing they were as a couple and as parents, and they found them to be a very loving and happy family. They were welcomed with open arms by a lot of the New Zealanders, and they appeared to have a picture-perfect life together. And after around 20 years of the Bouwers being married and them now moving to Dunedin, it seemed like Dr. Colin Bouwers' third marriage was now finally the final one. And by all accounts, they were both incredibly affectionate with each other. One of Annette Bouwers' close South African friends remembers how her face would light up when Dr. Collins entered the room, her voice would lift when he called her on the telephone, and Annette Bouwers never ever complained about her husband. Rather, she really seemed very proud of him. So there was a lot of love between Colin and Annette, apparently. But after working as a psychiatrist in Invercargill, I'm sorry if I said that incorrectly, Colin then took up a clinical post with Healthcare Otago, and here he rose to the head of department within his division. And Colin's annual salary was around 100,000 New Zealand dollars a year. He was also a part-time lecturer at Otago University, where he led a class discussion on using blood sugar lowering drugs in order to commit the perfect murder. Now, I know that university discussions can probably go haywire every now and then, but this is incredibly foreshadowing, so just keep that in mind. Now, remember, Annette, Colin's wife, was a physiotherapist, but once she had her two children that were now settled in schools in New Zealand, she decided that she no longer wanted to work as a physiotherapist, and also Colin was earning enough money to support her and his family. So Annette then just decided to be a stay-at-home mom, where she had a lot more free time now to do whatever she wanted to do. Greg Bouwer, their first son, went to Bayfield High School, and Anthea, their daughter, was a very successful pianist. The Bouwers lived in a very luxurious 320,000 New Zealand dollar home, and they lived on a house that overlooked the beach and that was on the slopes of a mountain, and they lived at the St. Clair Beach area. And it was often said that in the mornings, Annette would walk their dog named Cinnamon, who was an English Bull Terrier. And Annette would often just find the time to do jigsaw puzzles, she would knit, and murder mystery was her favorite pastime to read as well. Colin Bouwers also had a $262,000 life insurance policy taken out on his wife. So everything seemed to be going really well for the Bouwers. They had successful children. Colin was very successful and Annette was very busy and successful in her own right, but she wanted more. So when she was a stay-at-home mom during the day, at night she would go to night classes and she would learn how to use computers and how to do everything on the computer. And often Annette would go to these classes in order to help her husband Colin to write up all of his research results and everything for work on the family computer. Now remember I said that Dr. Colin Bouwers was never really a simple man. Everything was incredibly complicated and there was always something with Colin Bouwers. And even though Annette and Colin seemed to have the perfect romantic, happy relationship behind closed doors, there was a lot going on in the background. And sadly, it was possible that Annette knew that Colin was having a lot of affairs behind her back. And Annette really thought that moving to New Zealand was going to change him. They were starting anew, something had to give. However, before the family moved to New Zealand and while they were still in South Africa, Colin was having a lot of extramarital affairs and he actually worked at Tygerberg Hospital for a little while. And sadly, his affairs were not limited to South Africa, and it seemed to be happening in New Zealand now as well. And one of the former patients that Colin worked with in Tygerberg Hospital, she then told a South African journalist that Colin had once seduced her, was telling her how monogamy and fidelity was so outdated, and he would tell all of his lovers that his perfectly healthy wife was dying of cancer, and that they hadn't had sex in a really long time, and he really needed some help in all of these departments. So his wife dying of cancer was not the only lie that Dr. Colin Bouwers would tell about his wife, and not only about his wife, but also lies about his life as well. So Colin Bouwers would lie and say that he was actually, a while ago, part of the African National Congress, which is the ANC here in South Africa, and it's a political party. But basically, Colin said that he was part of the ANC, and back pre-94, he was actually arrested and a political prisoner because the apartheid government found out about him being closely linked to the ANC, and they threw him into the prison because they didn't like what he was doing. He also said that he was tortured by the apartheid government. And yes, this was actually all found to be a lie, because he once told a friend about his wife, and he said that one time his wife was gang. And he would say that this was incredibly traumatic for her, obviously, but he said that they didn't have a lot of sex because of this. It really had an impact on their relationship. And he also said that his second wife committed and that she killed her children as well, which were all lies, by the way, every single part of this. So those were all the affairs that were happening in South Africa that people knew about. But when Dr. Colin Bouwers was in New Zealand, he was having a very open and very public relationship with another doctor. And I feel like I shouldn't name her because she said already that this ruined her career, and a lot of the media deemed her as his mistress. So I won't name her, but I feel like she was quite involved with this in her own right later on in the story, but I'll leave it for you to decide. But because of this, we are just going to call Dr. Colin Bouwers' mistress, we're just going to call her Sam for ease. But this affair with Sam and Colin happened in 1999. So remember, they only moved to New Zealand in 1997, and all of this happened in 1999. And Dr. Colin Bouwers really didn't wait at all to start his affairs once again. And this was the only publicly known affair that he had. He probably had a lot more. But Sam and Colin met at a medical conference in Copenhagen in 1999, and their affair blossomed from that conference. Now, once Colin had returned from Copenhagen and this medical conference in 1999, all of a sudden Annette started feeling really, really ill. She was getting a lot of headaches, she was really dizzy, and she was vomiting often, and especially when she woke up and after she had just eaten. And at first Annette just ignored it. She thought maybe she was just coming down with something. But then a few weeks later, she fell into a deep coma. She was rushed to hospitals and doctors managed to wake her up again from this coma. And at first, doctors were quite stumped because they were unsure of what she was experiencing. And Annette was subjected to months and months of poking and prodding and testing. And she even had exploratory surgery to find out what was happening, because all of her symptoms were showing signs of a tumor. And when Annette was first taken into hospital for her coma, her doctors that were looking after her spoke to Dr. Colin Bouwers about who she should speak to, maybe a psychiatrist, because she might fall into a depression, and they really wanted Annette to be of healthy mind when she was going through all this trauma. So Dr. Colin Bouwers suggested that Sam be her psychiatrist. So because Sam was busy helping Annette with being a psychiatrist for her, she also then managed to really be a part of the family in a massive way. And I say this because Sam was very much part of everyone's everyday life. So she was doing the laundry for the home, she was cooking and cleaning for everybody. And this was while Annette Bouwers was in hospital. So Annette Bouwers wasn't at home yet. And Annette even said to their daughter Anthea that she's not quite sure why Sam is helping out and why she's even at the house. Then, on the 5th of January 2000, Greg and Anthea, who remember were Colin and Annette's children, they were at Sam's house watching the cricket. And during this day, Colin actually went to the courthouse to appoint Sam as their legal guardian, telling Annette's mom, his mother-in-law, that she was just a really close friend, and if anything were to happen, that Sam would be a perfect help to him. Now, if we take a step back, who is this woman? Annette is in the hospital, Sam is busy running Annette's household, basically taking over her life, within a few short months that Annette was even in the hospital. So sadly, the same night, on the 5th of January 2000, Annette passed away. And when she passed away, no one really suspected anything because Annette was so sick. She was really ill and things weren't really looking good for Annette. But things got a little bit tricky when doctors now wanted to perform a post-mortem or an autopsy on Annette. Colin refused and was absolutely adamant that his wife should not have an autopsy performed. But the doctor said to Colin that he cannot just give him the death certificate without an autopsy being performed. And then Colin went on to say that Annette's Jewish and it's against their religion to have an autopsy performed. And they also need to bury her body within 48 hours of her passing away. But eventually, Colin was overruled and a post-mortem was to go ahead. But then, even though Colin was busy spewing these lies about his wife being Jewish, for Annette's burial, they had an Anglican church ceremony. And when the vicar came to the house to bless the house and to bless all the people, the vicar said that the house smelled incredibly like detergent and like bleach. But the autopsy went ahead and the autopsy was performed, and there was a significantly high level of sedatives and insulin found within her bloodstream. And when police were busy looking through the house, they also found 11 prescriptions that were illegally written by Dr. Colin Bouwers. And when police asked Dr. Colin Bouwers about why there were all these illegal prescriptions, he said that he was incredibly depressed and he was suffering from cancer and he was now going to die, and he wanted to basically send himself off in his own way and via these sedatives. So police went away and they were incredibly suspicious about all the information that they just received, and they really went away to try and think how they could further investigate and get everything really, really accurate, because they thought that Dr. Colin Bouwers was definitely hiding something. But then, 2 weeks after Annette Bouwers had passed away, Colin then set up a trust, and he named his lawyer as one of the trustees, as well as Sam as one of the trustees. And he put Sam on his will in terms of getting the house. But as the weeks were going on, Colin was really feeling the heat from all the police investigations, and he was now getting really worried. And Colin Bouwers had actually every right to be suspicious, because the doctor who pronounced Annette dead on the day that he came there was the same doctor who was treating her at the hospital. And it was him who then went into her room and he was busy looking at all of her vitals and what was wrong and everything before he pronounced her dead. But it was actually his testimony that he gave to the police that really put Colin in hot water. And the reason is because while the doctor was busy looking at Annette's body, Sam came into the room and she was just kind of making small talk. But then all of a sudden she stopped and she said, "Oh, it's so funny how Annette really thought that Colin was poisoning her." And she kept on blaming Colin for making her sick, and she really didn't want to be in his presence anymore. And the doctor sat back and he thought that this was really suspicious, and he then took this information to the police, and that is the reason why Colin Bouwers was then arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife. Dr. Colin Bouwers was then taken to trial because he was under suspicion of murdering his wife, and when his children had to give their testimonies within this trial, it was a very sad one, I thought, because they were very callous, very emotionless apparently. And when they were done giving their testimonies, they left the stand where they had to talk, and then they went out into the gallery where there were other people. And when they had the opportunity to talk to each other, they spoke really loudly in Afrikaans to each other, with Sam there as well. But they would talk about their father in Afrikaans, and they would also badmouth their mother. And while their family friends and people they knew would go up and testify about Annette or Colin, and they said something that they didn't agree with, the children and Sam would then snicker and make faces, and they would just roll their eyes or they would snort in disbelief. And it was quite sad to think that they weren't really sticking up for their mom. But I guess also in the same sense, this is your only parent that you kind of have left. And if you don't believe that they're capable of doing something like that, you may defend them in any way possible, and I guess for the children, this is the only way that they saw fit. But apparently both Greg and Anthea's testimonies were completely devoid of emotion, and they also seemed to be quite forced, so it's like they practiced it. And Greg Bouwers especially described his mom as incredibly overbearing, and who was very controlling, and she really drove her children into being incredibly successful and the best of the best. One of Annette Bouwers' closest friends would really dispute this claim because she said that Annette was never like this. She loved her children, and whatever they wanted to do, she was there. I mean, she kind of gave up being a doctor in physiotherapy so that she could look after her children, be there whenever they needed. And I guess you can see this from both ways, if you were Greg or if you were Annette's best friend. But Annette's best friend really thought that Greg and Anthea were echoing their father's views more than their own. But with regards to, remember that doctor who went to check on Annette's vital signs after she had passed away and legally declare her dead, that doctor was the only reason why they actually performed an autopsy, because if Sam had never come into the room to talk about anything and to say that one comment about Annette thinks that Colin is poisoning her, then this doctor wouldn't have thought it suspicious and wouldn't have then spoken to the coroner about it. And if Sam had never said anything, Colin Bouwers may have gotten away with the perfect murder. So let's get into the details about what they spoke about in court. And 3 months before Annette had passed away, Colin Bouwers had written 11 false prescriptions for a cocktail of, one being sulfonylureas, metformin, and insulin. And these can all lower your blood sugar and induce hypoglycemia, which, if untreated, can cause weakness, blurred vision, slurred speech, sweating, coma, and ultimately death. But what Colin Bouwers would do with these 11 prescriptions is that he used former patients' names who didn't have any need for these lowering blood sugar medications. And around this time, Colin Bouwers also called the National Poison Center. And the reason that he called them was because he wanted to know if any of these three could later be found in the bloodstream. So very specific and very suspicious from Colin, I think. But what the court would later assume was that Colin was slowly administering into her soup or into her coffee, and that's why she always felt sick after she ate. And that's why Annette was giving the symptoms of insulinoma. It's basically an insulin producing tumor. But like we said earlier, Annette was poked and prodded for a couple of months, and she went under that exploratory surgery, and part of her pancreas was removed, but no tumor was ever found. But when part of her pancreas was removed, her health seemed to improve as well. 11 days after surgery, 4 days after the turn of the millennium, Annette Bouwers had died, which surprised her medical friends as well as Colin's medical friends. They thought that if Annette had become so ill that she was unable to eat, unable to drink, unable to do anything for herself, her medical, very well-known, very wealthy, very experienced doctor of a husband should have taken her to the hospital. When Colin's friends actually asked Colin why he never took her to the hospital, he would say that apparently he did, and she refused to, she didn't want to, so he just left her. Colin also said that New Zealand's medical services shut down after Christmas and New Year, which I think is weird because I don't think any country's medical services shut down ever. And a witness would also come forward during the whole court proceedings who was actually a lab technician at the time in the hospital that Colin worked. And she said that just hours before she knew that Annette had passed away or heard that Annette passed away, she remembers seeing Colin in one of their storage rooms looking for needles and looking for specific vials of these. And just after Annette Bouwers had also passed away, remember her dog Cinnamon, who remember was a bull terrier. Colin gave her dog away to strangers, and he never wanted this dog in the house. He never liked the dog apparently. He also changed their telephone number in New Zealand, so a lot of the South African families could never get in touch with Colin after Annette had passed away. And just before the trial, Colin was panicking. He was emailing everybody because he really wanted to know if insulin or if any of these other medications could be found in the bloodstream post-mortem. One of the medical professors that he knew, who was a medical professor in America, said that insulin was unlikely to be found unless it was specifically looked for. But because Annette Bouwers had so many different sleeping medications or different types of in her system, they specifically tested for all of these unlikely suspects to be in her bloodstream, and they found them. They also found a lot of these medications and sleeping pills in a mortar and pestle within the house. And when the cops asked Colin again why you had these sleeping pills crushed up in a mortar and pestle and why you had parts of insulin as well as these other concoction of in here as well, Colin said it was because he was dying of cancer and he wanted to take his own life. But then he said that he started stockpiling all of these medications because that's what he wanted to do. But then he said that his wife Annette got hold of them first and that she took her own life before he could take his life. So if we backtrack a little, and just before Colin was arrested and he had to go to trial, He was arrested in September of 2000, where he was then taken to trial. But when the trial first began, his name was actually omitted from the papers because a day before the trial had to start, he was an expert witness in another case. And that was about a railway worker who was charged with murdering his colleague. Colin had to be there to outline the mental effects of rostering on train workers. But during the entire trial, the police and even the prosecution had no idea how Colin really got that lethal amount of this medication cocktail to his wife. But the prosecution believed that the food and drink remained the biggest possibility. And especially because as she deteriorated more, she really relied on other people for sustenance and for help. However, the fact that the lethal doses of drugs that were found in Annette's body was being stockpiled by Colin Bouwers was enough for the jury to convict him. And I think that it's really chilling for someone to murder their loved one, but to sit back and watch your spouse, your partner, your loved one, or even anyone you know lie there and suffer and deteriorate is absolutely horrendous. Because Colin Bouwers sat back, watched his wife suffer with such cunning and premeditation, and there can absolutely be no greater personal betrayal. But in the end, Dr. Colin Bouwers was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 13 years, but this was increased to 15 years later on following an appeal by the Crown. But then, after serving almost 17 years in a Christchurch prison, he was released on parole and expedited back to South Africa. And in 2018, it was reported that Colin Bouwers passed away from natural causes, and he passed away in Durban, South Africa. And just before we go, remember I said to remember Colin Bouwers Jr. as well as Mariette? Well, Dr. Colin Bouwers, remember, had their son Colin Jr., and while Dr. Bouwers was busy waiting trial for the murder of his wife Annette, his son Colin was also on trial back in South Africa for strangling his first wife Ria to death, and his mom Mariette Kruger was also on trial for being an accessory to murder as well as tampering with evidence at the crime scene. So I mean, does it run in the family? But that is the case of Annette Bouwers. Let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope everyone is staying safe. Don't talk to strangers, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.